My name is Elena. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've occupied a very quiet role in the world. I work in a field where precision matters more than presence, where results speak long after the room has emptied. If you passed me on the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. People often assume I'm accommodating, agreeable, maybe even a little forgettable. I've learned not to correct them. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong with dramatic gestures or loud declarations. It's about something much slower, much quieter. It's about what happens when a child grows up unseen, and what changes when that child stops waiting to be recognized. For years, my parents barely noticed me, not in the obvious ways that make for easy outrage, but in the more subtle, enduring ways that reshape how you see yourself. I was fed, clothed, and educated. On paper, nothing was missing. But emotionally, I was background noise. When they spoke about me, it was usually in terms of limitation. What I lacked, what I failed to become, how little space I deserved to take up. At one point, those words hardened into something even simpler: a waste of space. I want to be clear about what this story is and what it isn't. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no screaming matches, no sudden lottery wins or miraculous transformations. What you'll hear instead is a long, honest account of invisibility, how it feels to be dismissed so consistently that you begin to disappear even from yourself. Over time, something shifted, not because they changed, but because I did, quietly, without announcement. I stopped asking to be seen and started observing instead. I learned how power actually works, not the loud kind, but the patient kind, the kind that accumulates when no one is watching. This is a story about distance rather than defiance, about preparation instead of confrontation, about walking into a room years later as someone your past can no longer explain away. And yes, it culminates in a dinner, an ordinary setting where nothing dramatic should happen, and yet everything finally does. If you're expecting triumph fueled by anger, this may not be the story you're looking for. What I'm offering is something calmer, clarity, restraint, and the strange relief that comes when you no longer need an apology to move forward. I'm sharing this because I know how many people live quietly under labels they didn't choose. If you've ever been overlooked, minimized, or reduced to someone else's disappointment, you'll recognize parts of yourself here. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered who you might become if you stopped waiting for permission to matter? To my parents, I was never a problem child. That distinction belonged to others, the dramatic ones, the rebellious ones, the children who demanded attention through noise or defiance. I was easier than that. I learned early how to stay within the lines of what was acceptable. I didn't cause trouble, I didn't ask for much, and because of that, I slowly became invisible. When people hear that parents ignored their child, they often imagine absence. Empty rooms, missed birthdays, neglect so obvious it leaves bruises. That wasn't my experience. My parents were always there. They attended school meetings. They asked about grades. They provided structure. But presence isn't the same as recognition. And recognition was something I rarely received. In our family, value was measured out loud. It was attached to achievements that could be explained easily to others. My older sibling had those. They were charismatic and expressive, and their struggles were treated as evidence of potential. When they failed, it was framed as temporary. When they succeeded, it was celebrated publicly. I watched all of this quietly, learning the hierarchy without anyone needing to explain it to me. I occupied a different space. I was described as fine. That word followed me everywhere. How's Elena doing? She's fine. Does she need anything? No, she's fine. Over time, fine stopped sounding neutral and started feeling like a closed door. It meant I didn't require attention. It meant there was nothing more to ask. At the dinner table, conversations flowed around me. My parents discussed work, money, and plans. When I spoke, it was often to fill the silence rather than shape direction. If I offered an opinion, it was acknowledged politely and then set aside. Not rejected, just unused. There's a specific kind of dismissal that doesn't hurt immediately because it's so subtle. It teaches you not that you're wrong, but that you're unnecessary. As I grew older, that message became more explicit. Comments slipped out casually, usually when they were tired or frustrated. Remarks about how I lacked drive, how I was too quiet to amount to much, how I would probably live a simple life. Once, during an argument that had nothing to do with me, my father gestured vaguely in my direction and said something I don't think he realized would stay with me forever. He said I took up space without contributing much of anything. No one reacted. Not him, not my mother, not my sibling. The conversation moved on. That was the moment I understood something important. In our family, my role wasn't to be seen or defended. It was to be useful when needed and silent the rest of the time. I didn't cry that night. I didn't confront them. I internalized it instead, the way children often do when they don't feel safe questioning the people who define their world. I told myself they were probably right, that maybe my value was meant to be quieter, smaller, that wanting more attention would only prove how little I deserved it. From the outside, I looked stable. Teachers described me as reliable. Friends said I was a good listener. At home, those same traits translated into being overlooked. Reliability doesn't alarm anyone. It doesn't trigger concern. It allows others to forget you're still growing, still forming, still vulnerable. By the time I reached adulthood, the version of me my parents believed in was already fixed. I was the child who would never surprise them, the one whose future was predictable in its modesty. They spoke about me as if I were already finished becoming. What they didn't understand, and what I didn't yet understand myself, was that invisibility has two outcomes. It can hollow you out, or it can give you space to observe everything. At that stage of my life, I was still hollow, still trying to earn a place by being agreeable, still believing that if I proved my usefulness long enough, someone would eventually notice. I didn't yet know that this version of me, the one they dismissed so easily, was temporary. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important at the time. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't loud or cruel enough to register as a wound. It was the kind of thing people later dismiss with a shrug, the kind of thing you're expected to forget, because nothing technically happened. I was 17, old enough to understand tone, young enough to still believe that effort could change how you were seen. I had spent weeks preparing for a small academic presentation at school. It wasn't a competition, just a research showcase, but it mattered to me. I had chosen a topic that required long hours of quiet work, data analysis, pattern recognition, conclusions that didn't announce themselves unless you looked closely. It suited me, and for once I felt something like pride. I told my parents about it in advance, not with excitement. I had already learned not to do that, but carefully, as if I were presenting a neutral fact. My mother nodded while checking her phone. My father said we'd see how the week looked. That was the first cut. Small, almost invisible. I told myself not to read into it. On the evening of the presentation, I reminded them again. My father was tired from work. My mother had made plans to meet a friend. They exchanged a look I had seen many times before, one that weighed inconvenience against importance. The decision was silent and immediate. They didn't come. There was no argument, no refusal, just absence. They said they assumed it wasn't a big deal. They said I hadn't insisted. They said next time I should be clearer if something really mattered. Each explanation carried the same message. If it were important, it would have been louder. I stood in a crowded classroom filled with parents who clapped too long and took too many photos. Teachers smiled. I presented calmly, answered questions, and received polite praise. On the outside, I performed exactly as expected. On the inside, something shifted slightly out of alignment. I didn't feel angry. I felt corrected, as if I had misunderstood my place. The world had gently reminded me that my milestones didn't require witnesses. When I got home that night, no one asked how it went. Dinner was already over. I reheated leftovers and ate alone at the kitchen counter. My mother mentioned casually that my sibling had an important meeting coming up and would need support. I nodded. I didn't mention my presentation again. That was the moment I learned how erasure works. Not through cruelty, but through repetition. through small decisions that consistently rank you just below the threshold of attention. Over the next few years, similar moments followed. My opinions were skipped over in family decisions. My schedule was assumed to be flexible, my needs adjustable. If someone needed help, I was reliable. If I needed acknowledgement, it could wait. And eventually, I stopped asking. What stayed with me most wasn't the missed presentation itself. It was the way everyone moved on so easily. The way the story ended was without any sense of loss. That told me something important. My absence, too, would likely go unnoticed. I didn't confront them about it. I didn't sulk or withdraw dramatically. I adapted. I learned how to compress disappointment into something manageable. I learned how to store it quietly. Looking back, that night marked the beginning of a pattern where my achievements existed only if someone else found them convenient, where my efforts were invisible unless they directly benefited someone louder than me. At the time, I thought this was maturity. I thought I was being understanding. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly being trained to accept less than I deserved, and to believe that asking for more would make me unreasonable. That first small cut didn't bleed, but it never fully healed either. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with insults or slammed doors. It settles in gradually, like background noise you stop noticing because it's always been there. By the time you realize it's affecting you, you've already adjusted your behavior around it. After that first missed presentation, I began to recalibrate my expectations. Not consciously at first. It happened in small internal negotiations. I stopped sharing plans unless I was asked. I framed my achievements as coincidences rather than results of effort. If something mattered to me, I downplayed it before anyone else had the chance to. At home, this adaptation was rewarded. My parents seemed more relaxed when I was agreeable, when I didn't require emotional bandwidth. They praised me for being low maintenance. That phrase followed me into adulthood, spoken as a compliment, never as a warning. The dynamic became predictable. My siblings' life was discussed in detail, setbacks analyzed, ambitions encouraged, mistakes forgiven. My life was summarized in brief updates. If I mentioned a challenge, it was met with practical advice that ended the conversation quickly. If I mentioned a success, it was acknowledged with a nod and then redirected to something else. At first, I told myself this was fairness, that my siblings simply needed more support, that my quiet nature meant I didn't require the same attention. I became very good at rationalizing imbalance, especially when doing so kept the peace. The truth was less comfortable. I had been assigned a role, and I was playing it well. Disrespect, when normalized, becomes invisible even to the person receiving it. I began to anticipate dismissal before it happened. If my parents made plans, I assumed I wasn't included unless explicitly stated. If they spoke about the future, I rarely heard myself mentioned. When they did refer to me, it was often in the past tense, what I used to be like, what I had always been good at, as if my development had stalled at some earlier version of myself. There were moments when the imbalance surfaced clearly. Family gatherings where my contributions were overlooked. Decisions were made on my behalf without consultation. Jokes at my expense that were framed as harmless because I didn't react strongly. Each instance alone was small. Together, they formed a pattern that quietly redefined my worth. I remember one conversation in particular. We were discussing career paths. My siblings spoke at length about their ambitions, and my parents listened attentively, asking questions, offering connections. When the conversation turned to me, my father smiled politely and said, "Elena's always been practical. She'll find something stable." That was it. No curiosity, no follow-up, just a conclusion, already drawn. I smiled back. I always did. Smiling became a reflex, a way to signal that I didn't require further consideration. Inside, something tightened, but I had learned to ignore it. Over time, I internalized their assumptions. I stopped imagining futures that extended beyond stable. I chose paths that were sensible, reliable, and unremarkable. Not because they were all I wanted, but because they were all that seemed expected of me. Ambition, I had learned, was reserved for those who had already been deemed worthy of investment. This wasn't self-pity. It was conditioning. When your environment consistently responds to you as if you are secondary, you adjust accordingly. You lower your voice. You make yourself useful. You minimize inconvenience. And eventually you stop noticing that your own needs are being deferred indefinitely. What made this normalization particularly effective was the absence of overt hostility. My parents weren't unkind. They didn't insult me daily. They simply didn't see me as someone who required growth or exploration. I was finished in their minds, complete, contained, predictable. I told myself this was fine, that not everyone needed to be extraordinary. Those quiet lives had value too. And I believed it mostly. Believed it was enough to stop resisting. But somewhere beneath that acceptance, a different awareness was forming. I was watching. Not just my family, but the systems around me. How attention flowed. How value was assigned. How people decided, often unconsciously, who mattered and who could be postponed. I haven't acted on this awareness yet. I wasn't ready. At this stage, I was still normalizing disrespect as a form of peace. Still choosing silence because it felt safer than disruption. I didn't realize that this period of quiet accommodation was also training me in something else entirely: patience. By the time I was in my early 20s, the role I occupied in my family was no longer implied. It was understood, unspoken, but firmly in place. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the person who would adapt without complaint. Every family system assigns roles, often without intention. Someone becomes the achiever. Someone becomes a rebel. Someone becomes the caretaker. My role was simpler and more limiting. I was the one who would not complicate things. When something needed to be done, I was called. When something needed to be discussed, I was often informed after the fact. I was trusted with responsibilities, but excluded from decisions. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. I noticed how my parents spoke about me to others. There was a particular tone they used: pleasant, reassuring, final. Elena's very independent. She doesn't need much. She's happy doing her own thing. These statements weren't questions. They were conclusions delivered with the confidence of people who believed they had already figured me out. And I didn't challenge them. Part of me was afraid that if I did, I would confirm their unspoken belief that I was demanding without justification. Another part of me had grown used to the safety of predictability. As long as I stayed within the role, I wasn't criticized. I wasn't a burden. I was useful. At family gatherings, this role became almost ceremonial. I helped with logistics. I filled in gaps. I listened more than I spoke. If tension arose, I smoothed it over. If someone needed support, I offered it quietly. No one asked how I was doing, not because they didn't care, but because they assumed I was fine. That assumption followed me everywhere. The most unsettling realization came when I understood that my silence was being interpreted as contentment. My lack of complaint was seen as confirmation that the role fit me. In reality, it fit because I had molded myself to it. There was a moment when this became painfully clear. My parents were discussing future plans: retirement, travel, downsizing. They spoke about where they might live and who might help them if needed. My sibling's name came up repeatedly, framed as someone whose life trajectory mattered and would be affected by these choices. When my name surfaced, it was in passing. "Elena will manage," my mother said. She always does. It wasn't meant to be dismissive. It was meant to be reassuring, but it landed like a verdict. I realized then that in their minds, I wasn't someone whose life required consideration. I was someone who would adjust to their decisions. My needs were assumed to be flexible. My future is adaptable. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still, very still, as if something inside me had finally stopped trying to be understood. I began to see the role clearly. Reliable, useful, invisible, the person you lean on without looking at. The one you assume will be there, unchanged, regardless of how much time passes. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And once I stopped resisting it, something unexpected happened. The role became a kind of cover. If no one was watching closely, I could move without interference. At this point in my life, I was still outwardly compliant. I fulfilled expectations. I maintained the image they had of me. But internally, a quiet separation had begun. I stopped measuring my worth through their recognition. I stopped waiting for them to notice growth. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't confront them. I simply accepted the role fully because acceptance gave me freedom. If they believed I was static, they wouldn't question change. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very invisibility that had limited me was now creating space. Space to observe, to learn, to plan without scrutiny. I wasn't ready to act yet, but for the first time I understood that the role they had assigned me didn't have to define who I would become. It only defined what they expected to see. And I had already learned how little they were looking. The day something shifted didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no dramatic realization, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. If anything, it was quieter than all the days before it. Ordinary enough that no one else would remember it. I do. I was 26, already working full-time, already financially independent, already living a life my parents described as settled. That word followed me now, replacing fine. Settled meant predictable, finished, unlikely to change. I had taken the afternoon off work to attend a professional seminar. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't something I told my parents about. By then, I had learned to keep my inner life separate from my family narrative. The seminar was on operational systems and long-term optimization, topics that sounded dull to most people, but felt strangely alive to me. I took notes. I listened carefully. I saw patterns that others dismissed as abstract. Afterward, I sat alone in a cafe nearby, reviewing my notes. Around me, people talked loudly about plans, frustrations, and ambitions. I stayed quiet, absorbing more than I revealed. At some point, I realized something that felt almost unsettling in its clarity. No one here knew who I was supposed to be. There was no role assigned, no expectations to meet, no assumptions about my limits. In that space, my thoughts felt sharper, less constrained. I wasn't filtering myself through anyone else's perception. It was the first time I understood how much of my identity had been shaped by being seen, or not seen, by my parents. How much energy I had spent aligning with an image that no longer fit me. Later that evening, my mother called. She asked if I could help with something administrative the next day. She assumed I would be available. I told her I couldn't. I didn't explain why. I didn't apologize excessively. I simply said no. There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough to register as unusual. She accepted it and moved on. To her, it was a minor deviation. To me, it was a test. Nothing bad happened. No one was upset. No accusations followed. The world didn't collapse because I prioritized something that mattered to me without justification. That realization landed more heavily than any argument ever could have. That night, I lay awake thinking about how many times I had preemptively limited myself to avoid discomfort that might never have occurred. How often I had chosen silence, not because it was necessary, but because it was familiar. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Something in the way I understood power changed. I saw that my parents' influence over me had less to do with authority and more to do with habit. I had been participating in my own minimization. From that point on, I began to make small internal adjustments. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling the silence. I stopped explaining decisions that didn't require approval. Externally, nothing looked different. Internally, everything did. I began to notice how people responded when I spoke less but with intention. How assumptions went unchallenged when they worked in my favor. How being underestimated created opportunities rather than limitations. This wasn't resentment, it was clarity. I didn't suddenly see my parents as villains. I saw them as people operating within their own constraints, unaware of the impact of their assumptions. That understanding didn't excuse the harm, but it freed me from needing their validation. The shift marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I stopped measuring progress by whether anyone noticed. I hadn't yet decided what I would do with this clarity. I only knew that I would no longer offer my inner life to people who had already decided its limits. From the outside, I was still the same Elena, reliable, quiet, settled. But internally, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was becoming a choice, Once silence became a choice, it changed texture. It was no longer something I endured or defaulted to. It became deliberate, measured, useful. I didn't announce this shift to anyone, least of all my parents. From their perspective, nothing had changed. I still showed up when expected. I still spoke politely. I still fulfilled my role. The difference was internal. I no longer explained myself unless there was a clear reason to do so. When my parents asked about my work, I kept my answers concise, accurate but incomplete. I noticed how quickly the conversation moved on when there was nothing emotional to engage with. They didn't probe. They never had. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer offering access. At first, this felt unnatural. I had been trained to over-clarify, to soften decisions with context, so they wouldn't feel excluded. Now, I resisted that impulse. I let pauses exist. I let assumptions stand when correcting them would only invite scrutiny. They mistook this silence for stability, for contentment, for the same quiet compliance they had always known. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. In professional settings, I began applying the same principle. I observed how often people revealed their intentions unnecessarily, how much information was given away in the name of transparency. I learned to speak when it mattered and to remain silent when it didn't. That restraint changed how I was perceived. Colleagues began to listen more closely when I did speak, not because I spoke louder, but because I spoke less. When you don't fill every gap, your words carry weight by contrast. This was the period when preparation began, though no one would have called it that. I wasn't plotting or scheming. I was aligning, learning systems, understanding leverage points, documenting patterns quietly. At home, my parents continued to rely on me in the same ways. They assumed my availability. They assumed my agreement. I didn't correct them immediately. I adjusted selectively. If something conflicted with my priorities, I declined without explanation. If it didn't, I agreed without resentment. The key difference was intention. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. They noticed the change only as an absence. I was slightly harder to pin down, slightly less accessible. Not enough to alarm them, just enough to create space. That space mattered. In it, I began to think long-term, about financial independence, not as survival, but as autonomy. About career, not as stability, but as positioning. About family, not as an obligation, but as a system I could engage with on my terms. Silence gave me the freedom to move without commentary, to grow without being framed, to change without triggering correction. There were moments when my parents tested this new boundary without realizing it. Casual remarks about how I had it easy. Comments about how my life was simple compared to others. I listened. I didn't argue. I noted what they believed. Understanding how people see you is a form of intelligence. Once you have it, you can decide whether to correct it or use it. I chose to use it. This wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't cold. It was calm. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I just stopped overextending. I treated my time and attention as finite resources. Gradually, something subtle happened. I felt less reactive, less defensive. When you're no longer trying to prove yourself, you stop needing others to understand you. My parents continued their lives, unaware that their access to mine had narrowed. They assumed this was maturity, that I was simply busy, settled, predictable. They didn't know that while they were no longer looking, I was preparing, not for confrontation, for independence. In silence, once a symbol of my erasure, had become the structure supporting my autonomy. What they never noticed wasn't a single achievement or turning point. It was a process, slow, unremarkable on the surface, and therefore invisible to anyone not paying close attention. And they weren't. From the outside, my life looked consistent. Same city, same job title for several years, same neutral updates when asked. No dramatic moves, no declarations of ambition. That continuity reassured my parents. It confirmed the story they already believed, that I had found my level and was content to remain there. What they didn't see was how intentional that stability was. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. I tracked my income and expenses in detail, identifying patterns and inefficiencies. I built savings quietly, not for emergencies, but for options. I invested conservatively, consistently, without discussing it with anyone. Money, I had learned, creates distance. Distance creates choice. At work, I stopped aiming for visibility and focused on competence. I volunteered for projects others avoided, the ones that required patience, cross-department coordination, and long-term thinking. These roles didn't come with applause, but they came with access. Access to information, access to decision-making processes, access to how things actually worked. I watched how leadership evaluated value, not by effort, but by impact, not by presence, but by reliability over time. I adjusted accordingly. I took courses quietly, certifications that sounded dull but carried weight. I read industry reports instead of motivational books. I learned the language of systems, risk, and leverage. None of this made for interesting dinner conversation, so I didn't mention it. My parents assumed my evenings were uneventful. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. They were structured, focused, accumulative. Socially, I narrowed my circle. Not out of isolation, but discernment. I spent time with people who didn't need me to perform or explain myself. People who valued consistency over charisma. These relationships didn't require validation, which made them sustainable. At family gatherings, I remained the same version of myself they expected. Helpful, calm, slightly detached. I noticed how little curiosity there was about my inner life. When I answered questions briefly, no one asked follow-ups. That absence of interest confirmed something important. I could evolve without interference. There were moments when the gap between perception and reality almost felt surreal. My parents would comment on how simple my lifestyle was, unaware of the complexity beneath it. They would express mild concern that I wasn't aiming higher, not realizing I had already redefined what higher meant. I let those comments pass. Correcting them would have required inviting scrutiny, and scrutiny would have slowed me down. This period taught me something fundamental about power. The loudest changes attract resistance. The quiet ones pass through unnoticed. I didn't need my parents' approval to build a life that was structurally sound. I didn't need their belief to create momentum. In fact, their underestimation became an advantage. It lowered expectations, which lowered interference. I was careful not to frame this as revenge. That would have tied my progress emotionally to them. Instead, I treated my preparation as neutral, almost impersonal. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about no longer being dependent on being right in their eyes. There were sacrifices. I said no to short-term pleasures that would have delayed long-term autonomy. I chose restraint when indulgence was easier. I accepted periods of solitude without interpreting them as failure. Through it all, my parents continued to believe they understood my trajectory. They spoke about me with the same calm certainty. Elena's doing fine. She's stable. She doesn't need much. They didn't notice that I had stopped asking for anything. What they never noticed was the accumulation. The way small, consistent decisions compound. The way patience can outpace urgency. The way silence, sustained over time, becomes a form of insulation. By the time the foundation was solid, the structure was already standing. All that remained was the moment when it would become visible, and that moment was approaching. The private reveal didn't happen in front of a mirror or during some dramatic late-night realization. It happened in a small, unremarkable office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when a decision I had been quietly preparing for finally crossed from hypothetical to real. I had just finished a meeting with a senior director at work. Not a celebratory meeting, not even a particularly emotional one. It was calm, factual, almost understated. The kind of conversation that doesn't feel like a turning point until you look back at it later. They offered me a position that didn't come with a flashy title change, no public announcement, no sudden shift in how people would perceive me. What it came with instead was autonomy, authority over systems that mattered, long-term influence rather than short-term visibility. When I left the building, I didn't call anyone. I didn't feel the urge to share the news. I walked home slowly, letting the weight of it settle, not as excitement, but as confirmation. This was leverage, not the kind that dominates a room, but the kind that changes your relationship to the future. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing documents I had been collecting for years. Financial statements, contracts, projections, contingency plans. For the first time, I saw them not as preparation, but as proof. I realized then that I no longer needed to accommodate assumptions about me. I wasn't dependent on approval. I wasn't constrained by proximity. I wasn't waiting for permission. The reveal was private because it needed to be. Celebration would have diluted its clarity. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. There was a strange calm in understanding that my life had quietly outgrown the narrative my parents still held. Not in a dramatic way, but in a structural one. Their version of me could no longer explain my decisions, my boundaries, or my future. That was when I understood the true cost of being underestimated. It's painful, but it's also freeing. When no one expects much from you, you're allowed to build without interruption. I thought briefly about telling my parents, not to impress them, but to update the story they were telling themselves. The idea passed quickly. Updating them would have served their comfort, not my truth. They didn't need to know yet. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I was more selective with my energy, more intentional with my time. I no longer felt the need to justify decisions that would have once triggered anxiety. At family dinners, I listened more than I spoke. I watched how easily they assumed continuity, how confident they were that nothing significant had changed. That confidence created distance, emotional and psychological, that I hadn't known I needed. This wasn't secrecy, it was containment. There's a difference between hiding and holding something close. Hiding implies fear. Holding implies ownership. I was holding my life carefully, the way you hold something valuable before you decide where it belongs. The private reveal wasn't about power over others. It was about power over my own direction, the ability to say no without consequence, the ability to walk away without loss. That knowledge changed how I related to my parents. Their comments no longer landed the same way. Their assumptions felt outdated, almost anachronistic, not offensive, just irrelevant. I didn't correct them. I didn't challenge their perception. I let it exist, knowing it no longer defined me. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt as a child. Choice. And once you experience choice without needing approval, you begin to see everything differently. The question was no longer if things would change. It was how and when I would let that change become visible. The decision point wasn't a single fork in the road. It was a convergence. A moment where several quiet preparations aligned, making inaction its own kind of choice. By then, I had options. Real ones. I could maintain distance and continue living parallel to my family, allowing their assumptions to remain intact indefinitely. I could slowly recalibrate the relationship on my terms, introducing change gradually, softly, or I could step fully into the life I had built and accept whatever consequences that visibility might bring. Each option had a cost. Staying invisible was safe. It required no explanation, no discomfort. It allowed my parents to remain at ease in their narrative. But it also meant continuing to split myself. One version for them, another for the world I was actually inhabiting. Recalibrating slowly would have been kind. It would have given them time to adjust, to update their understanding without shock. But it also would have required emotional labor I was no longer willing to provide. I had spent years translating myself into something palatable. I wasn't interested in doing that again. The final option was irreversible. It meant allowing my life to be seen as it was, without preemptive softening. It meant relinquishing control over how they would interpret the change. It meant accepting that some realizations come too late to be gentle. I didn't frame this as a confrontation. There would be no speeches, no accusations. I wasn't interested in vindication. I was interested in alignment between who I was and how I lived. The moment that clarified my choice came unexpectedly. My parents invited me to a family dinner, a small one. No occasion, just routine. My sibling would be there, along with a few extended relatives. In the past, these dinners had followed a predictable pattern. I would listen. I would assist. I would leave early, unchanged. This time the invitation arrived differently. I had recently moved into a new space. Not flashy, but intentional. A place that reflected the life I had built, rather than the one they imagined. I hadn't told them about it. The dinner was near my new neighborhood. I realized then that attending as my old self would be a form of dishonesty, not to them, but to me. I couldn't continue shrinking to preserve comfort that no longer fit. So I made a simple decision. I would go, I would arrive as I am now. I wouldn't announce anything. I wouldn't explain unless asked. I would let reality speak for itself. This wasn't about walking in triumphantly. It was about refusing to hide. The decision felt calm, not heavy, not emotional, just final. In the days leading up to the dinner, I noticed an absence of anxiety that would have once consumed me. I wasn't rehearsing conversations. I wasn't bracing for judgment. I wasn't hoping for approval. Whatever happened would happen without my intervention. That was the point. I understood then that the power of this choice lay in its restraint. I wasn't forcing recognition. I was allowing it. And if it didn't come, that would be information too. The decision point marked the end of preparation. There was nothing left to optimize or delay. The structure was in place. The distance is established. The identity solidified. All that remained was to step into the room without diminishing myself. Not to prove anything, not to reclaim the past, but to live in alignment with the life I had quietly built. In the weeks before that dinner, I didn't slow down. I didn't pause my life to prepare emotionally. If anything, I became more efficient. Movement, when done quietly, has a way of clarifying what matters. I finalized decisions that had been in progress for months. Contracts were signed. Accounts restructured, long-term plans moved from provisional to active. None of this was rushed. It was simply completed. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still answered messages when necessary. I still showed up to work on time. I still kept my calendar orderly. Silence, once again, did its work. It concealed momentum. This phase wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Legal documents, financial frameworks, strategic commitments that didn't announce themselves but altered the trajectory permanently. The kind of steps that don't invite commentary because they're invisible to anyone not directly involved. I was careful not to frame this as escape. I wasn't running from my family. I was running toward coherence, toward a life where my choices didn't require translation or approval. At work, my role expanded quietly. Authority without spectacle, influence without exposure. I learned that the most durable power rarely needs to be named. It's embedded in systems, not personalities. At home, my home, I refined routines. I invested in quality rather than display. The space reflected who I was now, restrained, intentional, self-directed, not impressive, grounded. My parents, unaware of these shifts, continued their assumptions. They spoke casually about my future as if it were already mapped. They offered advice I no longer needed. I listened without correcting them. Correcting would have required revealing things before I was ready. There is a particular strength in allowing people to underestimate you while you complete irreversible actions. It removes friction. It keeps focus where it belongs. I didn't feel secretive. I felt contained. This period taught me something unexpected about trust. I trusted myself more than I ever had. Not because I felt invincible, but because my decisions were no longer reactive. They were aligned with values I had chosen deliberately. I noticed how little emotional energy this required compared to the years I had spent seeking acknowledgement. Once you stop performing for validation, your capacity expands. By the time the dinner approached, there was nothing left to prepare. No loose ends, no unfinished business. The version of me that would walk into that room was not aspirational. She was already real. I chose my clothes carefully, not to impress, but to reflect accuracy. I chose my words with the same restraint. There would be no announcements, no explanations, unless they were requested sincerely. Moving in silence had brought me here, not to a climax, but to a threshold. The dinner wasn't the culmination of my growth. It was simply the moment when my life and my family's perception of it would briefly intersect. What they would see, or fail to see, was no longer something I could control. And for the first time, that didn't matter. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They began subtly, almost politely, the way discomfort often enters a room before anyone names it. The dinner was held at a restaurant my parents liked, familiar, comfortable, chosen without much thought. I arrived on time, not early, not late. When I walked in, there was a brief pause at the table. Not a surprise exactly, more like recalibration. My parents stood to greet me. My mother commented on how different I looked, then laughed lightly, as if unsure what she meant. My father nodded, took in the details without comment. My sibling smiled, curious. No one said anything directly, but the energy had shifted. I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't changed my demeanor. I was still calm, still polite, but something about me no longer matched the story they were holding. As the evening unfolded, small moments accumulated. I ordered confidently without deferring. I spoke when I had something to add, then stopped. I didn't rush to fill the silence. When questions came, I answered them plainly, without qualifiers. At one point, my father asked about my work. Not the usual polite inquiry. There was more focus in it this time. I described my role briefly and accurately. I didn't minimize it. I didn't dramatize it. The words landed heavier than they would have before. There was a pause. He asked a follow-up question. That almost never happened. I noticed how my mother watched me differently as the evening went on, as if she were trying to place me within a framework that no longer fit. She asked where I was living now. I gave her the name of the neighborhood, nothing more. Her expression shifted slightly. Recognition, then something like surprise. None of this was confrontational. No one challenged me. No one apologized. But the dynamic had changed, and everyone at the table felt it. The consequences began not as conflict, but as confusion. My parents had lost certainty. The version of me they had relied on, the predictable one, the manageable one, was no longer aligning with the evidence in front of them. And because I wasn't explaining the discrepancy, they had to sit with it. That discomfort followed them home. In the weeks after the dinner, their behavior shifted. They called more often, asked more questions, offered unsolicited advice framed as concern. It was subtle, but it carried urgency, as if they sensed they were missing something and were trying to reassert familiarity. I didn't push back. I didn't overengage. I responded calmly, selectively. The distance remained intact. The real consequence wasn't their curiosity. It was their loss of narrative control. For years, they had spoken about my life with confidence. Now, that confidence was fractured. They could no longer summarize me in a sentence. They could no longer assume outcomes. That loss unsettled them more than any argument would have. I watched this without satisfaction or resentment, just observation. This was the natural result of misjudgment catching up with reality. My sibling noticed it too. They asked me quietly one day if something had changed. I told them yes, but didn't elaborate. It wasn't secrecy, it was a boundary. The consequences continued in small ways. Invitations framed more carefully. Questions were asked more tentatively. A new awareness that I was no longer automatically available. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything was different. When you step out of a role without announcing it, the system has to adjust on its own. That adjustment is rarely graceful. I didn't need to say anything. The consequences had already begun. Once the consequences set in, my parents did what many people do when a familiar structure starts to fail. They tried to repair it retroactively, not by acknowledging what had been missed, but by attempting to reassert connection as if nothing fundamental had changed. It began with concern disguised as interest. My mother started calling more frequently, her questions framed carefully, almost rehearsed. How was work really going? Was I feeling overwhelmed? Did I need anything? The tone was different from before, lighter, almost tentative, but it carried an urgency that hadn't existed when I was actually invisible. My father took a more indirect approach. He sent articles, made suggestions, mentioned people I might want to talk to. These were the kinds of gestures he reserved for situations he felt slipping out of his control. What neither of them did was ask the one question that mattered. When did we stop knowing you? Instead, they tried to update their image of me without revisiting the past. They wanted continuity without accountability, adjustment without reckoning. I noticed how often they spoke in conditional language now. If you ever want to, In case you're thinking about, it was as if they were testing the edges of a relationship they suddenly realized had boundaries. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I had needed curiosity, there had been none. Now that I no longer needed it, it arrived in excess. I didn't reject their attempts outright. I accepted them politely, selectively. But I didn't offer access in return. That door had closed quietly, not out of bitterness, but out of timing. There's a moment in any relationship where repair is possible. And there's a moment after which repair becomes revisionist, an attempt to rewrite history rather than engage with it honestly. My parents had crossed that line without realizing it. They began referencing memories differently. Moments they had once dismissed were now reframed as meaningful. Achievements they had overlooked were suddenly remembered, not accurately, conveniently. Listening to this, I felt no anger, just distance. You can't retroactively show up for a childhood. You can only acknowledge that you weren't there. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, they tried to fold me back into the role they understood, adjusted just enough to feel current. It didn't work. The role no longer existed. At another family gathering, the tension was more visible. My mother hovered, my father observed. Conversation circled me more than it ever had before, but it didn't land. They were reacting to presence without understanding substance. I realized then that they weren't afraid of losing me emotionally. They were afraid of not recognizing the version of me in front of them, of having to admit they had misjudged something fundamental for years. That admission would have required humility. It would have required looking backward instead of forward. They chose neither, and so their attempts to fix things felt misaligned, almost too careful. They were trying to catch up to a reality that had already moved on. I understood then that some shifts can't be negotiated once they're complete, not because of cruelty, but because of timing. I had grown in a space they never entered. The distance that growth created was structural, not emotional. It wasn't something that could be closed with reassurance or effort. It would have required a different beginning. By the time they realized something was wrong, the conditions that created it were long gone, and I wasn't willing to reopen them. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't resemble anything I had once imagined. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no emotional release. It unfolded quietly, almost administratively, which somehow made it more definitive. It took place a few months after that first dinner. My parents asked to meet me alone. No siblings, no extended family. Just the three of us, seated at a small table in a neutral cafe. Public enough to remain calm, private enough to be honest. They spoke first. My mother said they felt something had changed between us. My father said they were worried they had done something wrong. The words were careful, measured. They were seeking clarity without inviting blame. I listened without interruption. Not because I was intimidated, but because I didn't feel rushed. Silence by then was comfortable. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't revisit childhood incidents. I didn't list grievances. I didn't argue over intent. I spoke about impact. I told them that for most of my life, I had learned not to expect attention, that I had adapted by becoming self-sufficient early, that I no longer built my life around their awareness of it. I didn't accuse them of neglect. I didn't use charged language. I described patterns, not moments. I spoke calmly, almost clinically, not to distance myself, but to be precise. They listened. My mother looked down. My father nodded slowly, neither interrupted. I explained that my distance wasn't punishment. It was alignment. That I wasn't angry, but I was finished adjusting myself to fit outdated assumptions. That the version of me they were trying to reconnect with no longer existed. There was a pause after I finished, a long one. My father asked if there was anything they could do to fix it. I answered honestly. I said no, not in the way they meant. That answer landed heavily. Not because it was cruel, but because it was final. It clarified something they hadn't wanted to face. That this wasn't a misunderstanding to be corrected, but a shift to be accepted. I told them that our relationship could continue, but it would look different. That I would no longer over-explain or over-accommodate. That I would show up as I was, not as who they remembered. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand accountability. I wasn't interested in retroactive validation. They asked if I still loved them. I said yes. That answer surprised them more than anything else I had said. They had expected distance to mean detachment. They hadn't considered that boundaries and care could coexist. We sat with that for a while. When we left the cafe, nothing felt unresolved. Not because everything was repaired, but because everything was finally named. Calmly, without heat. The confrontation didn't restore closeness. It redefined it. And for the first time, that definition was mutual. Who I am now is not a reaction to who I was then. That distinction matters to me. My life didn't pivot around a single conversation or moment of recognition. It continued forward steadily because it finally belonged to me. I'm still quiet. That never changed. But my quiet is no longer an absence. It's a presence that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. I live in a way that reflects my values rather than my defenses. My days are structured, intentional. I choose work that rewards consistency and depth over performance. I invest in relationships that don't require translation or emotional labor to maintain. I protect my time without guilt. With my parents, the relationship exists on new terms. There is more respect now, but it's cautious, still learning its shape. They ask before assuming. They listen more than they once did. Not perfectly, but enough to acknowledge that the dynamic has shifted. I don't mistake this for a transformation on their part. It's an adjustment, and that's enough. I no longer wait for them to understand me fully. I don't need them to. Understanding myself has proven more durable. What changed most profoundly wasn't my circumstances. It was my internal orientation. I stopped measuring my worth through proximity to attention. I stopped explaining my choices to make them more palatable. I stopped shrinking in advance. That shift carried into every area of my life. I take up space now, not loudly, but deliberately. I speak when it matters. I remain silent when it doesn't. I don't confuse visibility with value. The child who was once dismissed didn't become extraordinary in the way stories usually demand. I didn't arrive with a spectacle. I arrived with coherence, with a life that functions on its own terms. And that, I've learned, is something people notice eventually, even if they don't understand it. I'm no longer interested in being seen as easy or low maintenance. I'm interested in being accurate to my limits, accurate to my capacity, accurate to my needs. There is no bitterness in this, only clarity. When I look back at the person I was, the one who normalized being overlooked, I don't feel regret. I feel respect. She learned patience. She learned observation. She learned restraint. Those lessons became tools. I didn't discard my past. I integrated it. Today, my life is quiet in the same way deep water is quiet. There's movement beneath the surface, direction, weight, and I no longer feel the need to invite anyone to validate that. For a long time, I believed this story would end with recognition, with an apology, with some clear moment where my parents would finally see what they had missed and say the right words to make the years rearrange themselves into something gentler. That ending never came, and over time, I understood why it didn't need to. Some truths arrive too late to repair the past, but right on time to free the future. What I learned is this: being dismissed doesn't always break you. Sometimes it trains you. It sharpens your awareness. It teaches you how to move without applause, how to build without witnesses, how to grow without permission. But that only happens when you stop trying to earn visibility from people who benefit from not giving it. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliating anyone or proving them wrong in public. It's about choosing alignment over validation, about letting your life speak in ways that don't require translation. My parents didn't suddenly become different people. They didn't rewrite history. They didn't fully understand who I had become, and that's okay. Because the most important shift wasn't in them. It was in me. I stopped waiting for someone else to confirm my worth. I stopped explaining myself into smaller shapes. I stopped mistaking endurance for loyalty. The child they dismissed became something they could no longer deny, not because I demanded recognition, but because I no longer needed it. And that's the quiet part people don't talk about enough. When you stop chasing acknowledgement, it often arrives too late to matter. By then, your life has already moved on. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been the easy one, the overlooked one, the one people assumed would always adapt, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind. You are not unfinished. And you do not need a dramatic exit to claim your life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is grow so steadily, so quietly, that one day you realize you've already crossed the distance you thought would take a lifetime. Before we end, I want to leave you with one question, one that doesn't have an easy answer and doesn't need one. What part of yourself are you still shrinking because someone, somewhere, decided you didn't need the space? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not for agreement, but for honesty.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.